Welcome to the next episode of the Entrepreneurial Excellence podcast. It is a great pleasure to have Scott Belsky with us today. He is the Chief Strategy Officer and Executive Vice President of Design and Emerging Products at Adobe. He's also the author of two wonderful books, The Messy Middle and Making Ideas Happen. And he's also the founder of Behance, which is important for our discussions today because it's sold to Adobe. On top of that, Scott has also been an investor at Benchmark and a very prolific seed investor. Adding to that, which full disclosure, he happens to be a small investor in my company and also in my previous company. Scott, thank you so much for being with me today.
No problem, Adam. Good to see you.
Yeah. So one of the first key questions that I like to ask people, the podcast is called Entrepreneurial Excellence. How do you define excellence as an entrepreneur? And maybe related to that, how do you define success? And we can maybe talk more about that too, because it might have changed over time for you between when you were back in the day all the way to today.
Well, I think excellence, the moments where I feel any sense of excellence is when I feel like I've learned something. Sometimes it's a moment of self-awareness where I finally catch myself doing something I shouldn't do, or someone teaches me something, or we go through something and I say, wow, I'll never make that mistake again. And I'm so much more prepared now and qualified for what I do next. I think that those are those moments of excellence because it's hard earned, right? I mean, these are the moments of growth that truly differentiate you and allow you to make better decisions and outmaneuver, others that you're competing with. So there's some sense of excellence there. In terms of success, I think I'm always trying to figure out how to define success. I feel like in some ways, it's being able to own your time and focus your energy on the things that matter most to you. I think in some ways success is also around the fulfillment and satisfaction of seeing the people that took a risk with you, getting some sense of independence and financial independence or other opportunities. I have to tell you, like some of the founders of companies that came out of the Behance experience, that's always been like a certain type of gratification for me, because I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is like the next generation, of founders that have come out of the experience we were all on together in something I founded. So that always makes me feel like a degree of success as well.
And when you think through your entrepreneurial journey, I mean, so you went to Cornell for undergrad, then you worked at Goldman Sachs, and then went to Harvard Business School, and then also started Behance. Like, at least up until Behance, it was a fairly standard journey, I would say, which nothing wrong with that. But like, what made you decide to become an entrepreneur? Like, why did you say I need to go start Behance? And it looks like, am I right? Did you start it while you were also at business school?
Yeah, I did. And I think one thing about me that I've always tried to figure out, is it good or has it held me back? Has it held me back? Is, I'm a risk hedger. I like to make moves carefully. I always like to have backup plans. Starting Behance was a big risk. And so I decided to enroll in business school at the same time, just in case. When we were building Behance, we also had an organizational paper product line. We also had a conference. We also had an online task management tool for creatives. We were mission-centric, organize the creative world, but medium agnostic, meaning we'll do it any which way we possibly can. And some might look at that and say, wow, you were really hedging the business. And they were right. And I didn't know which thing would work. I assumed that one would. And now, I now wonder, maybe the best entrepreneurs actually do hedge risk, because as opposed to knock it out of the park, mentality, swing for the fences and win 1% of the time and change the world, or 99% of the time fail. I don't know. Maybe it's better to win 20% of the time but maybe not have a home run. Like, I don't, who's to say, like, how do we judge entrepreneurial success? I'm sure there could be books written about that. But what's always inspired me is frustration. You asked me what made me an entrepreneur. It was not the desire to work for myself. Obviously, I haven't worked for myself technically for many years, given I've stayed at Adobe. It's always been around frustration with something I felt needed to be solved, and the desire to take initiative, cause ruckus to do it.
Yeah, no, I love that. Cause ruckus and just desire to solve a big problem. And it's going back to the idea of hedging a little bit. It seems so different from the advice I like to give people, and I hear from a lot of folks, which is like, you have to be really, really focused. Arguably, the more focused you are, the better you can be at that specific task. Do you feel like that is sort of, do you give your founders you invest in sort of different advice? Like, is it like hedge a little bit, or even in your investing days, like what are the investments you've seen be the most successful? Do you think they've hedged a bit, or have they been more, I'm going to be just laser focused on this one big problem that I believe needs to be solved?
Well, my hedges have always been related to one another. So I have never been running a flower shop while also starting Behance. I have never been doing two completely unrelated things. It was always stuff that was in the same mission or the same direction. But I liked to have some different ships, in the race because I wanted to have, some options along the way. It's a good question. And maybe it's not for everyone. Like, I also think I'm pretty multi-threaded. Like, I feel fulfilled by doing many things at once, and thinking about many things at once. And that might just be my own sort of nature. But I also have times where I'm like all in on one thing too. So, I'm not always distracted. Like there are periods of time where I'll just get laser focused. So maybe it's what I have not seen is I've never seen a great company built by someone who had a full-time job. I've never seen someone have multiple companies, that they're building that are unrelated to one another that both succeed.
Although I guess Elon Musk maybe has sort of done that, but
Yeah, he's an
he's one of,
anomaly, right? And
yeah,
it's, and or people talk about Steve Jobs with Pixar. I mean, there are some great exceptions to this rule, and everyone probably wants to think they're potentially an exception, but all those folks kind of worked up to that by doing one thing for a period of time, right? It's a really good question, and I would argue though that in the earlier stage of your career, be all in on something. And then over time, if you develop the capabilities to do multiple things that feed one another, like at least make sure that they do.
Yeah, no, it's a great way of putting it. And then this actually leads to another question that I truly am curious about for you, because you do seem like you're doing so many different things, right? You have obviously a pretty important and big job at Adobe. You also write an awesome newsletter, Implications, which everyone should subscribe to and read. Then, of course, you do also investments. So how do you organize your day? How do you end up enabling yourself to focus? And has the way you've done that focus, has it changed at all again? Because, from when you were an early entrepreneur to today? And are there things that you would apply from yourself today back to when you were sort of a younger, earlier entrepreneur?
Well, I'm very like rigid and strict about my time. I try to say no to most things.
And by the way, thank you for jumping on this. It is a huge
Yeah, yeah,
thing.
yeah. Well, we go way back, so I wanted to say yes. I do though try to like really audit my calendar and say, did this hour move the needle forward for me in some way, or was it something that I was doing for someone that I feel good about? But you just, you have to say no to most things. I also try to only do different things that all have dots that connect.
Hmm.
So when I draft my Implications newsletter, which is only once a month, but I'm usually in a plane in 30,000 feet and I'm trying to connect the dots of things, is a very helpful exercise for someone who also runs strategy at a big company. And so I find it extremely helpful when I meet with entrepreneurs and hear what they're doing and what tools they're using to build what they're doing. I bring back a set of data points to the executive team at Adobe that I don't think they have. And I think that's part of my job is to keep our close connection to the world of new founders building new things, new practices for building and hiring, all that sort of stuff. Like I feel like I leverage some of that stuff every day, in my day job. So I love the connection between all these things. I don't really do many things that don't have like sort of dot connecting within the stuff because I want to achieve that multiplier of all the things I'm doing, kind of accelerating the potential of each one.
And do you, I mean, so then on a day-to-day basis, I mean, I know you have an executive assistant because I was working with her to help get this scheduled. Do you recommend everyone get an executive assistant? Do you, once again, is it sort of saying no and just saying, I'm going to focus on one or two really big things in a given day versus, an entrepreneur, early stage entrepreneur, especially, you're trying to figure out product, go to market, you deal with operations. There's all these different pieces you have to go, hiring, recruiting. How would you organize your day? Or even still today, how do you organize your day? And how do you make sure things just don't start piling up on your calendar and you're on meetings all day until 10 p.m. and then you finally can look at your email or something?
Well, increasingly, I do have this maybe almost spiritual view that every day is a canvas and it is what you make of it. And so I do always think of each day as like, how do I want to use this time? I mean, how lucky are we all to just be on this earth and to be healthy enough to allocate our time today in whatever we think will move the needle the most, both personally and professionally. And when you do that, which is hard to do because you always want to do favors and you don't want to disappoint people and everything else, you sometimes have to sit through meetings that are monotonous and feel pointless, but you can start to get, little teeth in terms of the decisions you make. And I do. I will be in a lot of meetings where I'm like, what's the purpose of this meeting? And can we all get the time back? But I also have had to remind myself, and this is one of those moments of, self-awareness and learning where sometimes your job in that meeting is not to get something out of it or to advance the ball forward. Sometimes it's just to have other people feel heard.
Yeah.
And when you're a leader of a team, especially a large team of people who don't get time with you, part of it is just like making sure that they get an opportunity to share firsthand the work that they're doing. And so you kind of have to remind yourself of what your job is and when you're making these decisions about how to spend your time. But I do try to allocate it. I have 2 blocks of 1 hour each that I use in 15 or 30-minute increments for external sort of founders and others that I work with. And then, the rest is allocated across the things that I want to move the needle on for Adobe or research that I want to conduct just to kind of connect all the dots.
In your meetings, I mean, when you have these meetings with folks, do you have a very specific, Amazon's fairly famous for sort of their memos that they require everyone to write. Do you sort of do the same things? Do you do it at Behance? Do you do it at Adobe where like, hey, like every meeting has to have a very specific agenda and you need to come maybe with a pre-read so we have a very focused meeting? Or is it, you let it be a little bit more freeform?
Well, I think when it's a product review, I really always want us to start with the problem we're trying to solve. And I also always want us to start with the overall flow, that a customer is going through before we jump into a specific set of screens. Because I think one mistake that product teams often make is they're not constantly considering the object model of like how a product works. Sometimes asking the question, how did I get here? What do I do now? And what do I do next? When you look at every screen is a good way of making sure that you're not reviewing something out of the context of a user's experience.
Yep.
So that's something that I oftentimes do. And product review meetings with me are very action oriented. I want to get into the flows. I want to debate. I want to make sure that everything makes sense. And so those have to be kind of agenda driven and prepared for. However, I've also developed the opposite desire when it comes to roundtable time with my team. When we have an agenda, we sort of feel imprisoned to what we're supposed to be talking about, oftentimes determined previously by maybe 1 or 2 people. On the contrary, I want to know what's naturally percolating on my staff's minds. I want the forces of natural selection to play into what we actually spend our time talking about. And so whatever we think we should be talking about, maybe it's like some new LLM in the AI world or blah, 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 blah. But sometimes what people really want to talk about is the thing that they're worried about, the thing that's naturally, surfacing when we have time together. And I want to capture that. And so I actually don't like agendas as much for that type of time.
Are there questions you ask to help people open up about those things that they're kind of hiding behind, this LLM discussion, but it's actually a real fear of AI or something?
Well, it's usually not like hiding. It's usually just making it an open space where people can share what's top of mind. So most meetings just don't have that because they're so packed and scheduled. And I think this is probably something I learned at Benchmark. Our partner meetings were very unstructured, notoriously, and we would just kind of spend the day together going through stuff. And it was a really effective way of surfacing the things that we were seeing, that we were thinking about, as opposed to, feeling like we had to lead or follow an agenda.
It's actually it's so different than I think the modern wisdom is in a lot of cases to be very specific, focused, have an agenda, be clear about your time, things like that. And just sort of say like, let's have a free form discussion with a bunch of smart people and see what comes out of it. It almost makes me feel uncomfortable because I'm so used to being more focused, but I like that idea.
It's also fun to ask questions, of each person. I mean, each person around the table has an expertise, right? A deep vertical that they cover. And oftentimes I will just go around and ask a series of questions I have for each person as a sort of form of kindling.
Yep.
Yeah, you also have to have a culture where you are celebrating the mention of elephants. The elephants in the room are the things that everyone's sort of thinking about or worried about, but no one's talking about. And oftentimes, in big companies, elephants are, gosh, like bad decisions made long ago that we still carry the burden of, or organizational debt in the form of a decision that should have been made but wasn't. And having a culture where someone can say, listen, like the architecture might also be wrong, or something like that. In these meetings in big companies where everyone wants to get to a decision and move on, sometimes there's not much tolerance for someone to surface like the elephant in the room. At one point earlier on in my tenure as chief product officer at Adobe, I encouraged members of my team, even further down in the organization, to send me an elephant memo. And it was literally like a one pager on what they thought was not being surfaced in one of the upcoming meetings that we needed to discuss. And I think those were really helpful to me in prioritizing certain platform issues, or making some moves with people that I would have maybe not ordinarily, thought about.
That's actually maybe a really good way segue into another area I would love to discuss with you, which is sort of culture. And so on the note of those memos, I can imagine those memos also being dangerously political sometimes. Like I could sort of see, well, hey, like I'm surfacing this because my colleague over here didn't bring it up, and suddenly it becomes this, I'm reporting on my colleague political sort of thing. How did you avoid that at Adobe? And then related, how do you make sure you're building the right sort of culture at Adobe, but also at Behance and other companies, startups that you've worked with? How do you create the culture, and what is the importance, actually, we should talk about that too. What is the importance of culture overall in overall sort of success? Once again, sort of undefined success, but success.
Yeah. I think, I hate the political stuff, but it exists in every organization and you can't deny it. I like to be the person who sort of says what he's really thinking and apologizes while he's doing it, but sort of does it anyways. And I think that, if you build a reputation of being the person who kind of speaks those things, I think you ultimately do get respect in a good organization with a good culture. And if you're in one where it pushes you out, like, then you don't want to be there to begin with. Like, it's not going to do well because people are not candidly discussing and debating the problems that actually matter. So, that's always been my approach. And I think if you talk to people, that work with me, they'll say there were examples where Scott kind of gave up something, from his organization because he felt like it was a go-to-market problem. And if it was under him, it would not have as much focus. And some people might say that's not politically smart, to give up something within your mandate. But I've always kind of, maybe it's because of the entrepreneur in me, or I just don't see myself as a big company guy. And so it's like, I think those things, if you do the right things, people will ultimately acknowledge them over time and recognize and benefit from it. So I think culture of transparency is important to me, a culture where people can speak their mind. I prefer to be in aggressive cultures as opposed to passive aggressive cultures. If someone has a problem with me, I love it when they call me up and say, Scott, why'd you say that?
Yep.
What I hate is when people don't, but still sort of wear it around. And that's just so when we went through our process at Adobe, the 6 or 7 of us at the top of the company did a process where we did the new kind of values, I guess you'd call it, of the company. And one was to create the future. One was to own the outcome. But one of them was to be genuine. And we felt that meant 2 things. One was people being themselves. We want people to feel comfortable being who they are, but also like be direct. Tell people really what you feel. And I remember when we were unleashing those or revealing them to the organization as a whole, I emphasized that directness piece. I was like, this is such an important cultural tenet. We have to embody this and we have to celebrate it.
And what did that look like then at Behance and then other startups you've worked at with cultural elements? And how do you hire for that too? I mean, because I think one thing I've learned, it certainly is, it's one thing to say you have all these cultural norms, and maybe even more so have the founder, of course, embody those. But then you need to hire for people who can handle that, because not everyone is okay in a really direct culture. They get offended.
Well, I think I've always tried to hire people for initiative rather than experience. I feel like people who are initiators and have a history of taking initiative and what's interesting to them will continue to do so, as part of your team. So I would say that's part of it. For Behance, we had a very direct and aggressive culture where very respectful, like we really respected each other, but we would debate and fight things when we didn't agree with them. And I loved that. I always felt like when we did engage in that debate and that fight, we would get sort of almost get this answer from the company as if it was like this sentient being. And only when one of us had apathy and gave up because we didn't want to engage in the fight did we really screw over the customer. And so I always was trying to fight apathy ruthlessly and keep people engaged in the debate. And when I would hire people for Behance, I would tell them, I'd be like, listen, one quirky thing about us, we like to debate things. We like to have strong assertions and really take each other on. But then when we leave that room, we're like all good again. That's just a cultural tenet. We kind of are proud of this. We know we do it, so we don't take offense. Is that okay with you? Because I wanted to scare away people who would not be okay with that.
Yeah. And do you think that sort of cultural mindset obviously worked well for Behance? Is that similar? Like when you think through the cultures that are shared by the best organizations or the best investments that you've made, do they have a similar mindset, or are there certain cultural norms that you think you to define as some of the best ones that entrepreneurs should try to have at their organization?
It's hard to say. I think back to my two maybe best performing investments on paper, at least so far. And you have Uber and Pinterest, two very different cultures. Pinterest I found to be a bit more touchy-feely, and Ben's a very quiet guy. I feel like he was not aggressive in your face. Evan Sharp, co-founder, designer, very soft-spoken as well, humble. And I don't think like fighting was a best practice of Pinterest, although Ben made a lot of very tough decisions over the years. And, it was always very product driven. I think both of them were very product driven. Whereas, Uber was very much like, let's fight it out, let's duke it out, aggressive culture that some people found offensive. I found it to be actually essential in the early stages of that business because they were like fighting the odds.
They were fighting
they
the
were literally
regulators.
fighting for existence.
Essentially the incumbents in it who were entrenched.
Right. And it's interesting. There's another company I invested in that folded, years later, that was trying to build a marketplace for custom sneakers. And it was, founded by a founder who didn't have the fight in him. Great product person. But when he was approached, by some of these big brands to shut down his marketplace because he was using their shoes with artists customizing them. I was so excited about the business. I was like, this is personalized fashion at scale. This can be a massive deal. But the first cease and desist letter, he gave up. He was like, oh my God, we have to pivot. And he just didn't have the fight in him. And I was, I remember thinking, gosh, if Uber were, Uber got cease and desist all the time. They just got starting to be shut down. And they were like, no, we have to change the law. The law is behind. We have to change it. And so it's a different type of founder mentality and culture are required for different types of businesses.
So do you think one thing what you were saying there, I wonder if this is true, but does the culture reflect the business the company's in as much as it reflects the founder? In other words, Travis Kalanick probably never could have founded Pinterest because it just wasn't the sort of business. He didn't have the mentality or the way, the personality for that. And Ben could never have founded Uber because he didn't have that level of fight in it. And so the culture kind of reflected the product itself. Do you think that's, I'm just talking through here with you, but do you think that sort of is true in some ways?
Totally. 100%. And by the way, how they say people start looking like their dogs. And I don't know how that actually works, but sometimes it feels like it works. Companies do look like their leader. And companies look like their leader. You can bring in all sorts of other people and that all adds a little DNA here and there to the business. But it is remarkable how much a leader's tendencies, their strengths, their weaknesses, their idiosyncrasies and quirks and whatever do permeate the culture because people start to act like them. They start to do what they think they would like, and this ladders down layer by layer by layer. And you really do end up being, you really end up getting a company that feels like the leader. And I think it's a great point you're making. I mean, it's these leaders that you just mentioned are not interchangeable, between those
Yeah, no,
companies.
it's funny as you're saying this to sort of reflect on myself and in how, I mean, in some ways you could argue then it becomes almost impossible to change a culture unless a founder themselves can completely change. And it's sort of, I reflect on my own company, Levy, the companies I've built, they are absolutely a reflection of my own personality and who I am. And sometimes that really bothers me because I think I should be more aggressive or different ways and all these things. And I'm like, wait, why isn't the culture reflecting this? And in the end, it's probably because like the culture's me. And that's for better and worse. And it's sometimes scary to see your own reflection.
I think that's insightful, and I think that's true. And as an investor, that's why when you're investing, when you're meeting the founder, you are. And I don't know if I'm really good at this. I think that I focus so much on the product and the business, and it's hard over a Zoom or something. Especially being an operator and not having much time to really get to know the founders' quirks and everything else, and then leveraging that as a layer on top of the investment decision. If you really wanted to be a great investor, you'd probably like spend a day with the founder and their parents or
Yep.
something, and just really get a feel for the chemistry, because you're really going to get something in the vicinity of that.
Do you think, even with that said, do you think there's a thread that connects, let's say, Travis and Ben, just keep using them as good examples, even though they're such wildly different personalities, did they share certain quirks or qualities about sort of obsession or resilience or past success where you say, hey, look, like, they did all, like, even for you as an example, okay, well, go to a great college, get a great job after college, get into a great business school. Like you're sort of have these things that at least are starting to say like, hey, Scott might be someone who could have quote unquote financial great outcomes and financial success when it comes to his startup. Do Ben and Travis share similar features? Like when you think through your investments, are there certain threads that connect the best founders?
By the way, I don't think that getting an MBA is a good.
No, I agree. Someone who has a JD and an MBA, I think those were negative experiences. I probably should have gone straight into building companies.
I don't like immediately lean in when it's an MBA,
Yep.
even though I had one. I feel like I hide it sometimes. I think but when I think about common traits amongst entrepreneurs that I deeply admire, resilience is certainly one of them. Clarity, ability to merchandise to their organization what matters. I mean, both Ben and Travis, since we're talking about them, were great.
When you
at
say
that.
merchandise, what do you mean exactly? Like break down key elements that are important?
Yeah, like Ben always with Pinterest, it was like the year of international or the year of monetization, or everything was very merchandised. And also people, when they made progress, they felt like they were making progress because progress begets progress, right? So these leaders were good at orienting their team around what mattered, what the strategy was, celebrating progress, making it clear to people what was coming next. And I think that clarity was a real crucial part of all the successes that I can think of. I think the relentless dedication, these leaders were all in. They were very truthful to themselves. I think they, even to a fault, like they were who they were, and they didn't try to, to change that. And super passionate, and really willing to get their hands dirty.
And for the ones who failed, do you think they failed, using the shoe example, maybe they failed because they sort of gave up, they weren't quite as passionate? Because if you're so passionate, you're just going to fight that. You're going to say, screw this cease and desist, I'm going to keep pushing forward. Are the ones who fail the ones who don't push forward? And where does luck play a role too? Where it's like, hey, like maybe you're just in the wrong market, wrong bet, wrong time. Because there's thousands of founders we probably both know who are some of the smartest people in the world and incredibly passionate, but they were off by 5 or 10 years with their idea.
Well, I think, why do things fail? I mean, there's all sorts of reasons. I would say a few categories of reasons that I've seen quite a few times. One is the lack of self-awareness. People just being crappy managers, and people do not want to work for them because they don't even see their own faults, and they're not owning the things that they're doing. And then the company and culture becomes one where people don't own the outcome. I think one is a large, cohort of startups that are started because a founder is passionate about a solution to a problem, as opposed to being empathetic with the customer suffering the problem. And when we're passionate about something and we just go off and create something to solve that problem, we're usually 30 degrees off of product market fit because we've lacked to gain empathy on some like ground reality. If they're building an enterprise product and customers secretly, but ultimately just wants to make sure they get recognized by their boss and get credit for their work. Like if your product totally automates something and that person no longer gets credit for the work they do, they're not going to use your product and they're not going to pay for it. So you could actually be having the perfect solution, but be off product market fit because you just lacked empathy with the end user. So it's things like that that I think get in the way of a lot of startups. I think some are not honest with each other with themselves about conviction and lack of conviction. We all have conviction when we start something, and then the more information we learn, the more quickly we either gain or lose conviction in the end result. I think a lot of companies keep going on well past the time where the founders have conviction. And that's never worked, in my opinion. What I do admire is the entrepreneurs that come back routinely and they're like, we're trying something new. We're trying something new. Didn't work. I'm like, that's such a great thing that they can quit a path that they were on as soon as they lose conviction, as opposed to some of these other companies that are just zombies. They just go on. These emails are like, we're still pre-revenue and we're still this. And it's just like, why, you're not being truthful to yourself. That you've lost conviction in it. And that's great because you've learned so much that you didn't know before. Like, why would you keep doing it if you've lost conviction?
How do you think, how should founders know when they've lost conviction? I mean, I'm going to argue there's a point where you get to a point where you're like, I don't have new ideas. Like I would say my answer, I guess, to this, I'll answer my own question to some extent, which is basically like, when you get to a point where you don't have new ideas for how you can solve the problem that you get excited by, that's maybe when you've lost conviction. But how would you define that so other people can know?
I think that's a good one. I think when you've lost passion in the ideas to address the customer's problem, that's certainly an indicator. I think also when you've learned something about the market that you didn't realize, or you learn something about the current consumer behavior that you didn't realize, or the competition that you didn't realize. And that thing, if had you known in the beginning, you would have never done this. Well, then don't do it. You're like, life is short. You're in your mid-cycle. You might still have resources. You certainly have your time. Like, allocate it towards something that you have conviction about. And that's something that I've really tried to challenge myself on over the years, even with products internally and new ideas and new efforts. It's just as soon as you learn something and it doesn't feel right. But for some reason in big companies, people still go to meetings and they'll still report out the progress they're making, even if they don't believe that they're going to win. And that's because they feel like it's their job to try. And so can you have a culture where people can speak up and say, this is not on a path and let's make a pivot. Let's do something different. It's your time.
Do you do that by incentivizing people to say, hey, look, like I actually like you don't get a gold star or promotion for just doing your job. You get a gold star for telling me this is broken and saying we need to go in a new direction and being honest about it.
Well, I think you have to ask the tough questions, so sometimes when I feel the lack of some energy in a meeting or lack of conviction, I will point blank say to the leader, do you believe this is going to win? Like, do you think this is a winning strategy?
Has anyone actually said, no? Like, sorry for my presentation. I just did like, no, I don't believe it is. Are they honest with you about it?
What they'll say, they'll either reply immediately with 100%. And Scott, you are missing something. And let me walk you through it. Or they will reply with, listen, there's so many moving parts and it's very competitive. We're doing our best. We do have a resource gap. We do have this issue and we haven't perfectly figured this, and they'll just like, and that's like a way of saying no.
Yep. It's sort of obfuscating, but it's basically saying no, they don't have conviction. When you think through, sort of jumping into another question I have, when you think through sort of, I call it kind of work-life harmony in having different like patterns, trends, and habits that the best entrepreneurs have, are there things you think through for yourself, for the people you've invested in, that they've done really well, at least, especially when they're deep in the midst of their startup? It might be a little bit different when you get a little bit later, and we can talk about that too. But are there just like, hey, like, not working, I've lots of founders I talk to, like, I'm working 100 hours a week. And I'm like, that's probably not healthy. You're actually going to burn yourself out. But sometimes there are those cultures that do that. I mean, I remember early days of Facebook, I had a lot of friends there. and they were working 7 days a week. Every day they were on, all weekend long, they were on conference calls doing stuff. And look where Facebook is today. So what are the sort of habits or trends you see across these founders that have had the most excellence and success?
Yeah. Well, it may not be popular, but I think they do have to always be on to some extent. And your brain has only a limited amount of RAM, right? And it's allocated towards all these tasks, the basic bodily ones, the loved ones you care about, the the safety and security things. There's a part of my brain that always is on the projects I'm working on. And I do have some friends that have this like very religious, like turn off attitude. It's like, oh, when I leave the office, I just like, I shut off. And when I'm with my family and loved ones, I'm 100%, and maybe I don't think there's a judgment here, because that might be a very happy place to be. I'm not able to get there because I feel most fulfilled, by having these different processes running at the same time. I have never met a founder that is able to build a great, sustainable, market changing company by having that attitude, though.
Yeah, that was
but maybe they make compromises that others wouldn't want to make, in regards to minutes spent with their children. So it's a really tough one. There isn't a right answer to that.
No, I think I would actually say, I would say you kind of gave the right answer, at least when it comes to entrepreneurial excellence, right? It's a different story with lots of other jobs and careers and things like that. But to be a great entrepreneur, you can't turn it off, because you are so passionate about it and obsessed. You're always thinking about it. And that can be challenging on everything else in your life. And so are there other like habits that you think are there healthy things you'd recommend to people when they think through, like, hey, like you probably are always thinking about your startup and your business as an entrepreneur, but hey, like still find time to do other things? Or was that not the case for you at Behance in the days? And like Behance was just all encompassing every day, and that's what it was for you.
Well, it was a particularly hard business to make work because we were building a massive, social platform. It was very content rich. There was all forms of media. It was a very complicated product that we had to keep relatively simple. And it was a user base that didn't have a very high willingness to pay for things. And it was just hard to, hack growth. Constantly, I was doing everything possible to get this thing to grow. So it did feel at times like a squeezing blood out of a stone type of exercise. Like, why couldn't I have just made an enterprise SaaS tool or something like that? I mean, these are all difficult things to do, but I don't know. I feel like the Behance journey, now that I've seen many other journeys, was particularly difficult. And I didn't have a family at the time until the very end of, being an independent company. So I really was able to just be all in. I think the reason why, by the way, the RAM is always on is also because the problems you're solving in any startup as an entrepreneur don't have clear answers. Like, they're new problems by default, right? I mean, that's why it's an entrepreneurial adventure. And so you're constantly like churning them because there's just no like there's no clear answer as to what to do. And so you in some ways have to have this like this machine just running to get to the answer at some point.
And probably pulling in threads from so many different disciplines too, like learning the same way you're even doing today, like learning from so many different areas enhances your ability to do your job well. Is there any advice that you would give if you could go back in time to your early days of founding Behance? Is there advice you would give yourself, like one or two pieces of advice you would have given yourself, your early self back then?
Let's see. Advice that I would give myself. There were probably like 2 lost years of Behance where we probably should have raised a little bit earlier to accelerate the growth that we ended up having to make and make some of the right choices that we ended up having to redo. Now, it's tricky because that may have created more dilution. I mean, there may have been less of a economic outcome than there was if we had raised money sooner. But the product would have been better, faster, and larger faster. So, which maybe would have increased the valuation. Like, I don't know. It's hard to say, but I think that's one. I think the other thing is just the most exhausting thing for me of those 5 years of bootstrapping and 2 more years as a venture-backed company, so 7 years, was just how like finely tuned and controlled the immune system of the team was. I felt like I had to know where everyone was at, what was working and not working for each person. And when something was off, I felt like the need to fix it myself. And I think that was helpful in some ways, but it was also very exhausting. And I certainly don't do that in a big company. And I maybe would go back and tell myself, like, you don't have to feel like that much responsibility. But let it loose a little bit, delegate to your managers, Scott. Like, that's a little too much.
Do you think you've become much better at understanding what it means to delegate and how to delegate and what things to delegate? I'm sure as you've progressed in your career, you're probably pretty good at that now.
Yeah, I think so. I've been managing very large teams for the last, 6.5 years. And even before that, after we were acquired by Adobe 3 years, I took on more and more. And maybe this is where business school was useful. Like I was trained in management, and I was also, at Goldman Sachs working in a leadership development organization as well for a period of time. So I became really interested, in the field of leadership. And it was a new learning curve for me, but I ended up finding my approach.
Yeah, it's one of the things that we work with a huge number of companies at Levy, and I'm always shocked by how many founders aren't good at delegating, even though they have the right. They work with us, so they're already thinking they should delegate some work, but even then they're still pretty bad at it. So my final question that I ask every single person on my podcast is, if there's a single piece of advice that you could give to every entrepreneur to achieve excellence, what would that piece of advice be?
Well, remember, it's not about you. There's probably the dirty little secret of the best companies that were startups that succeeded was that they just stuck together long enough to figure it out, because the team owned it. The team owned the outcome. Everyone felt like a founder. No one ever felt like the hard work and compromise and sacrifice that they were making was just accruing to one person who was taking credit. And, the moments that I've had as a leader where I was like teary-eyed were seeing the team like achieve things, and become different people and feel the pride, and the outcome and the reward. And I just think that that's such a crucial part of any of these bold ventures. This messy middle, as I like to call it, is just extraordinarily volatile. It's full of anonymity, ambiguity, uncertainty, and anxiety. And if you can really empower people to do their greatest work, like they'll very much surpass what you're capable of. And so entrepreneurs, sometimes they need to be ego enough to like think they can start something on their own. And then they have to realize they can't do anything.
Yeah, it's actually a fine balancing act, right? Because you have to be crazy enough to say, I'm going to go build something that hasn't existed in the world. And then as you said, to like have that team who can build with you and get through that tough time, because everybody goes through, you maybe have a quick initial spike, and then you go through that messy middle where it's like, things aren't working the right way. We're not growing the speed we want to grow at. What's wrong? But then of course, do you still believe and are you obsessed with getting to that outcome? Yep. Scott, thank you so much for being with us today. I sincerely appreciate it. How can folks find you if they want to get in touch, learn more about you, read your book? They can find them on Amazon, but how should they get in touch and learn more if they want to hear more from you in your wise wisdom?
Thanks. Well, my focus these days is a monthly newsletter called Implications, and it's simply at implications.com. And it's a really fun way for me to get ideas out there, hear what people have to say, connect the dots, and hold myself accountable to some of the ideas that I'm brewing. And then the two books, Making Ideas Happen and The Messy Middle, are the two kind of art projects of my life so far, where I've taken what I've learned from others and some of the research and things I've been interested in and tried to share it broadly.
Are we going to get a new book from you someday?
I don't know. I might be done with books.
Hey, look, fair enough. People don't have a long attention span anyways, so I can understand.
Exactly. Who reads books anymore?
Exactly right. Scott, once again, thank you so much. All of our time is so precious. I really appreciate that statement, by the way, of your point there is say no. Time is precious. Thank you for taking your time to spend it with me and with all the listeners. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam.